Okay, so give us a few seconds for everybody to join us online. We're in the webinar on, really for me, it's an awesome topic. Maybe you're not as excited about the topic, but I'm excited. As soon as I saw the article and the uh, title and the photos in the Smithsonian Magazine, I immediately reached out to Isma'il, an old dear friend and colleagues from Northern California, that this is a topic that we need to have a conversation about. And he introduced me to Matt as well to try to get both of them, because they both have worked on the both articles that we will be discussing. And this is just for us to introduce a topic. And earlier I was saying that when you approach the topic of Sudan as a country, but also as a history, you're almost always dealing with a threefold erasure or threefold removal of focus on Sudan. One is that you have the focus from European scholars on Egypt and trying to locate Egypt in the long history, not only sometimes of North Africa, but also Sudan, and they might take it all the way down to wherever they can, looking and trying to get that lens. But the second is looking for Egypt in Sudan. So Sudan does not get really the focus that it needs. And then the third, also looking at Sudan from trying to locate Islam, Muslims, Sudan in the regional conflict, rather than actually approaching Sudan's history, which 3,000 plus years, if not more, that we know is documented. So it's a pleasure for me to have Isma'il Kushkush with me today. He's a journalist, wrote for New York Times, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, and now the Smithsonian Magazine, and really a dear friend from long time ago. He's a graduate from UC Davis, up the street from us in here. I knew him from the time during the work of the anti-apartheid movement in Northern California, so really a long history. And it's really a pleasure to be introduced to Matt Stirn with us, an archaeologist and a photographer based between Jackson Hole and Boston. He's currently in Wyoming, where they're expecting a snowstorm. So if he's get cut off from us, it's definitely by no means that we are censoring him because we didn't like anything. It's because the snow. So welcome, and really it's a pleasure to have both of you with me today. So the first question, really just to introduce maybe a short biography. What got you into this topic? I know Sudan, I know Isma'il, you have done some work, but what got you into this topic, and how did you begin this research?
I mean, for me, it was personal, trying to discover your roots, trying to understand your own history, the history of ancient Sudan, or the kingdom of Kush or ancient Nubia. Was never taught in the curricula of any of the schools that I went to, whether in the United States as a child or in the Middle Eastern countries that I lived in Kuwait or in Syria. As a child, that history was never taught. I mean, I remember vividly in the 5th grade as a child studying the history of the ancient history of the region. We studied ancient Egypt, Levant, Mesopotamia, Persia, Greece, Rome, but never of that of ancient Sudan. So, I mean, I remember asking my father about that, and gave me a brief description that the country does have pyramids and ancient temples and so forth. But since the 5th grade, at the age of 10, every time that I was on a summer vacation in Sudan, I would go to the National Museum, collect as many books as I could and read about it. And I studied history as an undergraduate student at UC Davis, and I studied African and Middle Eastern history. And that's what got me into it. My work as a journalist in Sudan, as a reporter for the New York Times, gave me a chance to go to some of these ancient sites, and gave me a chance to, at times, to write about it even.
And Matt?
Yeah, so my history as an archaeologist goes all the way back to when I was 13 years old. But throughout my career of doing that, and then covering other people's work as a photographer, I've constantly been drawn to stories, as kind of Ismail said, that you feel the entire story isn't being told. If I have trouble researching it in a library or on the internet, I'm instantly fascinated that there's an untold narrative that exists that is worth exploring. And in regard to Sudan, this actually was kind of serendipitous that an old college roommate was working on the new visitor center at the Merowe Pyramids, and I made that connection to go, and I started to research a little bit what I could about Sudanese history, Sudanese archaeology, and that exact same thing happens that continues to draw me across the world, in that I could only find fragmented information on it. There really wasn't a lot out there, and oftentimes what I did find was almost entirely related to conflict or very negative or difficult stories in Sudan. And like everywhere, that's not the only narrative that exists. And so I was absolutely fascinated. And so I spent a couple of years trying to put this project together, and finally got to go this spring and pursue it, and was delighted to find this amazing culture and amazing history that the world really should know about. And that Ismail and myself can do a little part to bring that to light.
Great. So let's go through maybe some of the chronology of history. I know that in your articles, you say 3100 BC, approximately the date. So take us into that. Take us into that history, and then we could go back and forth between you and Isma'il on that.
Okay. Well, actually, so looking in Sudanese history, what fascinates me most is going even further back to, say, 10,000 years ago, and that was a really fascinating time when the Sahara Desert wasn't quite formed yet, and Sudan looked a lot like modern-day Kenya or Tanzania. There's actually a couple petroglyph sites, rock art drawn in Sudan along the Nile that has amazing panels of people hunting things like giraffes or elephants or hippos, things you don't associate with the desert at all. But over time, by entirely natural causes, the desert began to form. And as a result, people began to congregate. And you kind of see that all over the world. As soon as a lot of times climate changes in one circumstance, people come together and an amazing change happens. And that's what we call the Neolithic Period, when people settle down, they start farming, and all of a sudden towns and then cities pop up. And in Sudan, that city was called Kerma. And Kerma is located near the Great Bend of the Nile, and was the largest and earliest Bronze Age city outside of, in Africa outside of Egypt. And what a lot of people didn't realize for quite a while is that it was entirely separate. Throughout its history, it began to have a long intertwining relationship with Egypt, but at its core, at its very beginning, it was an entirely African city. And well, I'm sure we'll talk a lot about this, but it took archaeologists almost a decade to realize this.
And that's basically that the early European archaeologists identified as an extension of Egypt.
They did, yeah, exactly.
Rather than having its own historical development that is distinct and different from Egypt.
Yeah, it was a group of American archaeologists. And as you said, they went to Sudan looking for Egypt, not to Sudan looking for Sudan. And that's unfortunately exactly what happened. And that they arrived there and they found these fascinating cities with pyramids, Bronze Age cities. And it did look similar to what they were finding in Egypt, but they were not prepared whatsoever at the time to acknowledge that it could have been somebody else. It could have been an actual African civilization that was separate. And it wasn't until really the 1960s that a Swiss archaeologist, Charles Bonnet, did make that connection and entirely changed the entire world's view. But to do a real quick history of Sudan, Kerma lasted a very, very long time, almost 1,500 years as a Bronze Age city, traded massively throughout the Middle East, Africa, and up into the Mediterranean as well. And then eventually Egypt did conquer Kerma. There was a back and forth conquest between the two, and Kerma pushed into Egypt and back and forth. But eventually Kerma did succeed to Egypt. But the people from Kerma moved south to another city, Napata. And that's where the real Kushite kingdom that is really being recognized in our Smithsonian article came to light. And they continued. Oh, go for it.
Isma'il, I read your piece, and you intersperse your piece with your personal narrative and how your visit to the pyramids in Sudan about 25 years, and you thought that you were almost hugging them. So speak
I
and
literally
intertwine.
hugged the pyramid.
Yeah,
I
in
literally
Sudan, and again, not the ones in Egypt.
Yes, the one I have a photo of that. Yeah, I mean, I think on early Sudanese history, it's also important to recognize that this region of the Nile Valley, which the southern part of the Nile Valley, which is a part of the the Great Rift region, early human peasants in East Africa that we know of, it's linked. It's close to what we the early findings that are in Ethiopia and Kenya. What we call prehistory. You find evidence of that in different parts of Sudan, even in places like Khartoum or Sinjar, or the rock paintings in Arwaynat in western Sudan near the Libyan-Egyptian border. But I mean, as Matt was mentioning, I mean, Kerma and its predecessors, what archaeologists have called the A group and the C group. These are the very early civilizations that of ancient Kush, of ancient Nubia, of what today is what we know as Sudan, and it goes through various developments. And in its time, it was a rival to Egypt. Even Kerma. I mean, we usually think of the kings of Nepeta conquering Egypt, but even Kerma itself went all the way to Thebes and almost had an alliance with the Hyksos. So I mean, the early history of ancient Kush parallels that of the Old Kingdom in Egypt and the Middle Kingdom, and that there is a history that, as you mentioned, that is often seen as a part of Egyptian history, but in fact, it really was an equal rival to ancient Egypt.
And I liked when your discussion about the Nabta and the archaeological digs in there show that it was part of also a regional of African and Central African influences that is distinctive than the development that we see in Egypt. So either you or Matt can speak about that in terms of the distinctive features that we see in the land of Kush in this sense.
I think Matt's article goes a lot into that.
And if you want to share photographs,
Yeah.
by all means, and to speak about them, I could turn the sharing because you asked for that, so you could do that as well.
Yeah, I can always pull some together, but I think at Kerma in particular, you really do see a congregation of a lot of different African cultures, especially in the early years there. And the archaeologists are still trying to figure out where exactly they came from. One of the biggest reasons is there's not a lot of parallels anywhere else to compare them to. And the primary reason is because not a lot of archaeology has been done in, for example, in Sudan, south of Khartoum, or into South Sudan, or other countries surrounding. But what they did find is, as Isma'il mentioned, archaeologists give people cultures we don't know horrible names sometimes. And so we're calling them the A group, the B group, and the C group. And that's what George Reisner in the early 1900s termed them, and it stuck. But what he's identified is that the types of artifacts that these cultures brought into Kerma correspond to what we see in places like Ethiopia and South Sudan and further into Africa. And they came from all over the place. And so you almost see Sudan as this kind of central point for all of these early African cultures coming together and evolving into this brilliant civilization. And it's really neat to see.
Right. I mean, I would add to that also, it's important to understand that the geography at the time was different from what it is today. Mm-hmm. For example, one place that I think could possibly reveal much of that history is a place like Wadi Hawar, which is a dry valley coming all the way from Chad all the way to the Nile, which many believe in its time was a river, a tribute to the river Nile, Some even call it the Yellow Nile. We know there is the Blue Nile, the White Nile, the River Nile, but this dry valley that comes all the way from Chad into near the town of Debba is an area where it just shows you that the geography was different, that migration was very likely happened, that populations moved from different parts of the region to various large centers like Kerma. So that plays, I think, to keep that in mind is relevant in how migration and the moving of people came to influence this ancient civilization.
Yeah, maybe let me ask the question. Have you find acceptance and welcoming for the work that you guys have done in terms of those who are engaged in archaeology, but then you have also the Egyptologists and how they received the work that you guys have put forth, and also in general, maybe in Sudan's academic circles, is there an interest? Is there some consistent work on trying to navigate and narrate this ancient history?
I think today there's more acceptance to this argument, say, than it was maybe 30, 40 years ago. That the idea that ancient Nubia, ancient Kush was a civilization that stood on its own, that was a rival to Egypt, then simply looking at it as a mirror of Egypt, a reproduction of ancient Egyptian civilization. I think one of the problems in the study of history and archaeology is sometimes the social and political utilization of this knowledge, I think, overshadows the complexity of history, where people are looking for simple answers to prove a point, a political point or a social point. And history is much more complex. I mean, the most common answer in the social sciences is it's complicated. But I think today we're seeing more of a recognition of an acceptance to the argument made in the essay, that this was a genuine local African civilization that should be understood on its own. I think within Sudanese circles, that's something that many have been discussed, have tried for a long time to show the world. But it also has had this rediscovering of Sudan's ancient history within Sudan is relevant in how Sudanese understand themselves, how they understand their identity, an identity that's a product of many layers of cultures. I think this is what's relevant here in this essay, that there is no one pure understanding of self.
Well, I'm reminding of your TED Talk, so I'm taking you a little bit back when you said your application at UC Davis, and you filled all the boxes of.
Exactly.
Then that was your talk, which is the complexity of identity in Sudan in terms of putting African, putting Black at the time, Arab, and a whole host of other identities. And then the school put you as African American, as far as I remember.
Yes. I mean, AA was the first thing probably that the computer picked up, and that's how that was recognized. But yeah, I mean, identity is complex. It's a product of history and of many layers. I think rediscovering at a more mainstream and widespread level this history, I think, is relevant to many Sudanese youth today, especially.
Matt, do you want to add something to this?
Yeah, a little. So I was thinking back to the beginning, how archaeologists are thinking about Sudanese history in comparison to Egypt. And I think, as Ismail said, especially today, a lot of archaeologists are a lot more accepting, just because a lot more work has been done. People recognize what they're actually seeing, and they're more open-minded and being willing to change perceptions of that. But kind of the great travesty is that this didn't happen 100 years ago. And earlier this winter, when I was working on the Archaeology Magazine story on Kerma, I was interviewing a Egyptologist, a curator of Egyptology at the MFA in Boston. And Boston was where George Reisner, one of the original archaeologists, the American archaeologist going into Sudan, worked for. And I was asking him at the time how a recent exhibition on ancient Nubia went, which they held at the end of 2019 into early this year. And he said it was okay. It was a decent turnout, but in comparison to, for example, if a King Tut exhibit or an Egyptian exhibit were to arrive, it was no comparison whatsoever. The Egyptian exhibits get so much more recognition. And in asking why this was, his response was, well, King Tut in ancient Egypt is a household name all around the world, but Nubia or Kush is not. A very small community actually recognizes what that is. And so it's very unfortunate that 100 years ago, when the world was fascinated in that part of the world, that an incorrect perspective kind of diverted Nubia and Sudan out of the picture and focused in on Egypt.
Well, maybe that raises a bigger question, and feel free to chime on it. That archaeology, Egyptology, the whole studying of the East went hand in hand with the colonial project.
Mm-hmm.
So Egypt was a major springboard for colonial design because it was seen as the bridge of access for the Mediterranean to the Red Sea trade for the British.
Mm-hmm.
So archaeologists' interest in Egypt was a byproduct of the colonial enterprise, and therefore Sudan gets to be left out, which still continues to be part of, I would say, the contemporary dynamics.
I think archaeology and many of the early social sciences, anthropology, I think went hand in hand with colonial projects. But even before getting into that, I think one of the challenges to understanding ancient Kush, ancient Nubia, was that Egyptologists depended heavily on ancient Egyptian writings about ancient Nubia, ancient Kush, basically depending on their rivals and their views on this kingdom. So it wasn't abnormal for ancient Egyptians to describe their rivals as vile, the vile Kushi, and so many of the early Egyptologists, that was their perception also of how they viewed ancient Nubia, ancient Kush. But also many of the early archaeologists came out of Semitic studies, of biblical studies, and they had a particular understanding of the ancient world, the ancient East, and how they saw that. It is a growing pain, so to speak, to come to where we are at now. Rediscovering mistakes, biases in trying to interpret this history.
Definitely, for a considerable period of time, the archaeology was attempting to locate the narrative of the Bible rather than actually making the evidence narrate history on its own.
Absolutely.
Matt, you wanted to say something. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was thinking what's fascinating too, though, is fortunately, I don't think we're too late in this, and that I think we're actively seeing a revolution in the political sense in Sudan, but a revolution in the sense of the world recognizing the Kingdom of Kush in Sudanese history for really what it is. And what really fascinated me the most during my entire time in Sudan was seeing how this entire change in direction is almost being driven by the youth in Sudan, as opposed to, for example, outside European or American archaeologists looking inwards. And so it's this amazing cultural revolution that's having the world look in, and that doesn't seem to always happen that way. And that was really fascinating as an anthropologist and a photographer and just a person to witness for a little bit.
Now, I was fascinated with the survey of the City of Necropolis, is it? which has 30,000 burial sites, which is really the largest burial sites of the ancient world that we know of.
Yeah.
But it's just like completely erased. There's not a, I don't remember any sustained piece of media, TV, or any coverage of such a massive, discovery.
Yeah, and I think I think the necropolis at Kerma, I think, is the one.
Yeah.
And that was that. I mean, that absolutely dumbfounded me. It's not every day, even as a professional archaeologist, you go to something of that magnitude, having never heard of it before. And I remember we showed up in our truck, and there it was, and was just absolutely flabbergasted at it. And I think the large result of that one not being known is it's almost entirely the efforts of two people trying to expose that to the world. And it's Charles Bonnet and Matthew Honegger, both Swiss archaeologists. And they've done an incredible job, but it's been a massive uphill battle to get recognition for that site. And it still is. And it is, yeah, it's one of the largest cemeteries in antiquity anywhere in the world that is there. And one out of every 10,000 people in the entire world maybe have ever heard its name.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, I think with Kerma, which many would see as the root or the base of the ancient Cushitic civilization, much attention is to the pyramids of Nepeta, of ancient Nepeta, or the pyramids of ancient Meroe. Visually, they are more striking, but it is Kerma that I think where there is, I think, a more interesting story, and an older story of how Kush first came to be. And as Matt mentioned, I mean, archaeologists like Charles Bonnet, I mean, who's now 87 and has been going to northern Sudan every year since the early 70s. It's been an uphill battle with his own colleagues in the field to prove that this is something distinguished. I mean, as a child, do remember reading about Kerma as an Egyptian outpost. And not as something indigenous, as something a capital in its own right. But there's still much to uncover, I think, in this story. The Sudanese state since independence has been, at civil wars, instability. I think generally in many global South countries, archaeology, history, the social sciences are seen as secondary, are looked down upon state funding into this, unless there's a perceived immediate economic benefit, through tourism. There's not adequate research or funds put into these studies, I think, that can tell us more about who we are today.
Now, in the article that you shared about those who are ravaging and taking gold and digging some of these sites, you reference that Sudan is the third largest producers of gold. And if you ask the regular person, they have no idea about really the depth of resources, the richness of the country, but also how to actually undo that imaginary, not only in relations to Sudan, but much of Africa. Africa, I always insist, is the richest continent in the world, but in our imaginary, as well as influences the type of research, the type of work, it actually constantly constructs this almost double erasure or triple erasures that I was speaking about.
Right. So, I mean, gold mining in Sudan, I mean, is ancient. I mean, there's one explanation on the root of the word Nubia as the land of gold that was exported to Egypt. But today, gold mining, I think, is a mixed blessing. As far as archaeology is concerned, because much of that gold mining today is artisanal, it's independent, it's by young college students who could not find work and just go out in the desert and searching for gold. At the same time, coming across artifacts and looking to sell those artifacts to buyers. I think there was recently a week ago a news piece in AFP about gold diggers who went to this ancient site where archaeologists had been working and used modern machinery and destroyed the site in their search for gold. And who knows if there were artifacts that were stolen and being sold in many of these black markets. So, I mean, but yeah, Northern Sudan, Sudan is a country that's rich in its resources, but, gold, like oil before, is a mixed blessing, depending on how the mining and the is regulated and what protection is offered to these ancient heritage sites.
Matt, was it your photograph that had that was used, or somebody else's photograph?
No, we didn't. That happened after we had went, unfortunately. But it's a problem we face archaeologically all over the world, and there's a lot of parallels to conservation. We call it cultural conservation, as there is environmental conservation, where you things that are monetized, for example, environmental resources, or in this case, gold, or cultural resources like artifacts, take precedent over preservation. And so that's the same reason you see in a lot of places rainforest disappearing, endangered animals being killed or becoming extinct. And the same goes to certain histories. Entire histories can be wiped away from similar actions of people looking for money. And so another kind of hope, at least a little bit personally with this article, was to maybe encourage more people to be able to go to Sudan and visit, because a lot of times, just like in very delicate environmental places like the Amazon, the hope is that if you can encourage more people to go and spend money to see what's there, then there might be less of an effort to take that away.
But that raises the tension between, let's say, encouraging a form of tourism to these sites and the tab of destruction, and then also
Absolutely.
a black market. And I'm sorry for using the term black, but a side market that actually begins to feed on this tourism industry that's there.
Yeah, so it's a delicate tightrope, and I don't know if there is a great way to, an obvious way to proceed on that. But yeah, with obviously more tourism, you do end up with the potential for more issues. But if not, you have the potential for sites to become abandoned or resources to be pulled away from them. And so I don't know.
I have a question that was put on by Sarah, but to talk about the areas changing name throughout history, and when did that start being called Sudan, and who is it that called it Sudan? And did the people themselves or outsiders called it Sudan? So maybe delve into the names and the change in history of the use of the name for the country right now that we know is Sudan.
So, I mean, the country or regions of the country have had different names. Many of the names did in fact come from outside. I mean, this area around Kerma, this root of civilization in the region, had its own local names like Yam and Wawat. But what became popular were the ancient Egyptian names throughout history. Taseti, land of the bow, being that the inhabitants were skillful archers. Tanhesi, land of copper, the very name of the famous African-American writer Tanhesi. Kush, there's a debate on the origin of the name of Kush. It is believed that it is a local name. Its meaning, people debate on the meaning of Kush. It is a name that was used in ancient religious texts. It has become associated with blackness, Kush. I think interestingly, even in among Hebrew speakers today, the word Kush is used to identify a black person, at times used as the equivalent of the N-word. You have Nubia, you know, and we're talking about the geographic area between the first cataract on the Nile and basically more or less Khartoum. You know, the southern border, you know, shifts, you know, how far south or how far north do we go? But this region was also known as Nubia, and one explanation, at least, is you know, land of gold. There were various sultanates, you know, kingdoms in this area. The Sultanate of Sinnar, which was the first Islamic polity to rule in the area. A little to the south, up to around the Third Cataract. But the name Sudan, as we know it today, the term comes from the Arabic term Bilad al-Sudan, which was used in the you know, the Middle Ages, so to speak, to describe the region between the Atlantic and the Red Sea, you know, the immediate sub-Saharan Africa. It was a general term, maybe the equivalent of the term Africa at its time, at least for the Arabs. But the actual applying of the name Sudan to this modern nation state that we call Sudan really comes in the mid-19th century with Egyptian Ottoman rule, the rule of Muhammad Ali Pasha, whose military expansion and conquest south of the First Cataract all the way to Lake Victoria in what today is Uganda, and even eastward to include what today is Eritrea. The collection of these various regions, Sinnar, Nubia, Darfur, Kurdistan, in 1848 with Muhammad Ali Pasha's agreement with the Sultan of Istanbul, named it Sudan al-Masri, the Egyptian Sudan. Now, Bilad al-Sudan would translate into, it's commonly translated into Land of the Blacks, which is close, but I think a more accurate translation is in the plural format. Bilad is plural, lands or countries. Sudan is a plural of Sud, of blacks, a plural of Aswad. So it's really lands of the black nations. So that term was used in the 19th century, Sudan al-Masri, and then you know, after the Mahdi revolution in Sudan and the reconquest and the establishment of the British-Egyptian rule, it became known as the Anglo-Egyptian Sudan, to distinguish it from another country that also had the name Sudan, the French Sudan, which is modern-day Mali. So in the early 20th century, had two countries with the name Sudan. With Sudanese independence in '56, the country opted to keep the name Sudan, and that's where you get the name. Of course, you have also in 2011 the independence and secession of South Sudan, which also kept the name, and that's which is known today as South Sudan.
Matt, do you have anything to add to this, or?
No.
Maybe I have a question that looks at identity, construction of identity as it relates to history and archaeology. Sudan is a very complex society in terms of its identity. So narrating the Nubian part of the history is also coming in at a time where you have contestation around the identity of the country. So how do you see your work, both of you, at this current period? And again, you don't need to, if you want to take it in the political direction, that's fine, but the whole construction of identity through looking at the past, because one aspect is that the Nubian identity is really not centered, not part of the national project since the independence of the country, and that's at the crust of contestation within Sudan, even as we speak. And I'm not touching even Egypt, because that's a whole different question as well.
Yeah, Isma'il, if you want to start, and then I can fill in there.
Sure. I mean, I think one of the challenges to the Sudanese elite since independence is establishing a narrative that is all-inclusive to the country. The dominant narrative had always been to describe Sudan as an Arab country. Arabness is an element, is a part of who Sudanese are, but it is not the only element. And I think one of the problems is in how we understand history or misunderstand history. The narrative that generations of Sudanese grew up on is that you have this ancient history, and then with the fall of a kingdom, it ended there. And then you have new migrants that came and started something new. So in this case, the idea that you have this ancient kingdom of Kush, with the fall of Meroe around 400 AD, you have something new. The Christian kingdoms of Nubia and the Middle Ages of Sudan, and then with the fall of that era, and the coming of Islam and migrants of Arab groups, that's something new. That, of course, I think is an incorrect way of understanding the history, and that's how Sudanese elites, I think, propagated the understanding of Sudanese identity. I believe that most of the people that make up what today is Sudan are the very same people that were there for centuries. Yes, there might have been newcomers, but people just don't suddenly disappear from the map. Arabness in Sudan, I think, is better understood under the understanding of Arabization rather than an ethnic Arab complete takeover of lands. People intermarried, intermixed, adopted new cultures. In the Middle Ages, when we think of the beginning of the process of Arabization of Sudan, claiming to be an Arab in the 1500s, I like to joke, is something like having a U.S. passport today. It gave you protection, it gave you social status, but in fact, many of those people are this very same people that were there for centuries. I think any DNA analysis of the people that make up, most of what today is Central and Northern Sudan, I think we'll find multiple roots. Ethnic, the idea of ethnic purity, which I think, unfortunately, Sudanese political elites for decades saw the country. I think is simply false. The people are a product of multiple layers of cultures that went through different processes that make the unique character that is, and the unique features, the unique culture of what today Sudan is. There have been attempts throughout modern Sudanese history to build on this, create a new understanding. In the 60s, you had literary movements like Al-Ghaba Sahra, the forest and the desert, understanding Sudan in terms of its Africanness and its Arabness. Sudanawiya, Sudanism, the belonging to this modern nation state of Sudan. I think today, I think as a new generation, and especially after the revolution of 2019, has come to a greater appreciation of this diverse background. And I think that's how understanding, say, ancient Kush, I think, can contribute to many young Sudanese today in understanding these various elements that make up who they are.
Matt,
yeah. Well, actually, I have a question for Isma'il. And so when we were traveling in Sudan, or even following the progress of the revolution last year, something that really interested and fascinated me was the attachment that a lot of the Sudanese youth, or at least the ones that were getting media attention, had towards ancient Nubia. Even some of the most award-winning photographs that came out of the revolution were of people dressed up as the Kandaka, the Kushite queens, chanting slogans relating to Harka, the ancient kings of Kush. And the street art all over Khartoum now, so many of them display images of the revolution right next to scenes of the pyramids in ancient Nubia. And something I didn't gather, because during my time there, we only traveled in Nubia. And so I didn't know if you were to go somewhere else in the country, say Darfur or Kassala, would those communities share a similar attachment or sentiment towards this kind of revival of ancient Sudanese history, or is there more of a disconnect from it?
I mean, I think that's a good question. I mean, and it's been a debate, especially online in over the last year. I do think that the people of northern and central Sudan would definitely feel a stronger attachment to that ancient history. Say people from other provinces, Darfur, the Nuba Mountains, or not necessarily the Nuba Mountains, but maybe Darfur or the east. But I do think there's still research to be done in this. I don't think that the final say on the extent of the reach of the ancient kingdom of Kush into what makes up to what we call today Sudan is I don't think the final word is there. I mean, you take the Nuba Mountains. I mean, the Nuba Mountains, which is today would be a southern province of the Republic of Sudan, not to be confused with the Republic of South Sudan. But there are clear cultural links of the people of the Nuba Mountains, linguistically, culturally, to ancient Kush and ancient Nubia, or even in the consciousness of many of people of the Nuba Mountains. There is some evidence that dialects of Nubian languages were spoken in places like Darfur. That may be today extinct, but there is evidence that some of that did exist. So, I mean, on your point, I do think that maybe the people of northern and central Sudan feel a greater attachment to this, and especially, to be even more specific, those who still speak Nubian today, the people between the third cataract and the first cataract. But I do think the issue comes to understanding history as history, and instead of the politicization of certain understandings of history. Someone from the area of Shendi, next to ancient Merowe, who today speaks Arabic, may or may not be conscious of the fact that his ancestors probably spoke Merowitic or Nubian, because of that narrative, of that national narrative of that doesn't look into history as history, that does that that where social status, where political opportunism is attached to a certain understanding of history. I think there's much more research that still needs to be done, but it is understandable. I mean, if you're from an area where you see the pyramids,
yeah, for sure,
yeah, you're definitely going to have a stronger attachment to that than maybe someone who doesn't. But I'm of the opinion that we still don't know. That is not to say that when we look at cultural and educational policies in Sudan today, is to center an understanding of what it is to be Sudan on that history alone. I think the issue comes to understanding that this is a big country, this is a diverse country. There are links and relations, but there are also many histories.
I think Talib Abdul Rashid has a good question that I want to put. He says, can you speak to the theory that of the Nile Valley civilization originating in the south and spreading northward from the upper to lower Nile? So again, this will alter our perspective of actually how to view the civilization of the Nile Valley in its totality.
I was looking for the question. Was the question written out?
It was in the question and answer.
Okay, I see. Yes. I think Ismail hit on this point very early on, and I think looking back into time, looking almost into the Paleolithic, the dawn of what we call modern day humans. Mm-hmm. I think as more people begin to explore Sudan, and I think in the following years, it's going to hopefully be a lot easier for archaeologists to do that in the southern parts of the country. We often hear as places like Kenya or Ethiopia as being the cradle of civilization. But I think as more work is done, we will see that flow into Sudan as well, and that will be part of the epicenter. But fast forward a million years into what we're talking about with the Egyptians and the Kushites. Yeah, I think based on what Charles Bonnet has found at Kerma, it very well may be possible of kind of a northern movement from the south. That's what these groups, the C groups, the B groups, and the A groups, and there's many more cultural groups at Kerma that the archaeologists haven't identified who they are yet, but a lot of the theories place them coming from further south in Africa and coming northward. And so I think that eventually Kush and Egypt did become very intertwined culturally and ethnically. But at the very beginning, back at the start of Kerma, I think there was a lot more ties potentially to the south.
I mean, I think there's a lot, there's much more research that needs to be done on this, but I think it is at least acceptable that this is a possibility, and next to the facts that many of the early humans that we know of are from this Great Rift Valley region of Kenya and Ethiopia and possibly into Sudan, is to look at even how the ancient Egyptians looked at a place like Jebel al-Barkal. Jebel al-Barkal for the ancient Egyptians was the source of creation. There's a temple in this area next to the ancient town of Nepeta that was highly revered by the ancient Egyptians. Now, whether that was a political gesture of the ancient Egyptians at the time, whether it was rooted in some ancient Egyptian understanding of who they were and where they came from, I think that's there could be debate there. But I think there's the idea in itself. I think there's greater acceptance today to venture into that kind of research.
There's a question about pre-Arabic influence in North Africa. What were the cultural and ethnic similarities of ancient Egyptians and ancient Nubians? Pre-Arabic influence.
Right. I mean, if you want to go by the religious explanation of who the people of Kush and the ancient Egyptians as, the descendants of Ham, Mizraim being the ancestor of the ancient Egyptians, and that's where the word Mizra or Misr come from, both in Arabic and Hebrew. Kush being the brother of Mizraim, being also a brother of Canaan or the Canaanites. That's one way of looking at it. There are also other explanations, but there definitely cultural and geographic links between the ancient people of Nubia and the ancient Egyptians. If for nothing else, just geography, being right next to each other.
Anything from you, Matt, on that? Or
no, I think I was thinking along those exact same lines. In that, archaeologically, it gets very tricky to differentiate things like self-identification, self-identity in the ancient world. And so we can only look at the material record, the artifacts and architecture that we find, and the similarities between what you see in Sudan and Egypt are very close. But unfortunately, the archaeology doesn't have the resolution to really differentiate how the cultures were separate. But and I think that's part of the reason why it took, unfortunately, the world a lot longer than other places to maybe recognize that. I mean, for one, they probably weren't ready to anyways, but the material record was vastly similar between the two kingdoms, the two civilizations, just from being geographically close. But yeah, it's one of the shortcomings of archaeology on how to dive into that on a personal level.
Well, we have a question from an old friend, Ilyas Rashmawi from UC Davis. He says, archaeology and anthropology typically consider the colonized as subjects of discovery. And do you think that there needs to be a revision in social theory to better understand history of civilizations? For example, the use of the term prehistoric should be removed from social texts, as it carries a notion that history begins with the West, or often begins with the written, right? And therefore tends to prejudice on the history, culture, traditions of those who both oral or what we call indigenous population. So your thoughts on Ilyas?
I agree 100%. And from a perspective having to deal with this or having to think about it very carefully from working all over the world, I think there absolutely needs to be a better term. And to give a little background on myself, the vast majority of my work is in the United States, in North America. And we work closely with tribes throughout the Rocky Mountain West, the Shoshone, the Crow, the East Shoshone, the Bannock. And we work with a lot of times the elders of these tribes and work with them. How do we talk about your history? And from what we've noticed here is there's quite a bit of diversity in a preference in terms that are used. Certain tribes actually prefer prehistoric over ancient. Others prefer ancient over prehistoric, and others prefer none of that whatsoever. And so I think that the idea of prehistoric, meaning prehistory, has a vastly colonial sense to it. And it's hard. It's a culture that's very embedded, and it's one that probably should be changed, but it might be one that has to be changed on a different scale in different places around the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of that is happening and is in the process. I mean, many of the archaeologists I interviewed for this essay, highly praised some of the local archaeologists that they had worked with in presenting understandings of their findings that they may have not been aware of, that they may have had preconceived notions of. I mean, if you want to use a term like decolonizing archaeology, I think that is something, long gone are the days of the Indiana Jones understanding of archaeology, I think. And anthropology. I think, the social sciences at large, we're seeing more of a local contributions and understandings that provide a better understanding of the research.
Okay. We have another question from Katie Dickinson from the PSR. So welcome and good to have you with us. She said, we studied an interesting article last year. Can a Kushite change his skin? Kushite, Racial Othering, and the Hebrew Bible, 2006, by Rodney S. Sadler, Jr. Have you heard of it? What do you think?
I have not heard of it, but I mean, I'm guessing that a Kushite can't change his skin seems derogatory. But I mean, as I mentioned earlier,
so she said, "Can a Kushite change his skin?" That's
right. I mean, it seems to have a negative
connotation.
Connotation. But I mean, as I mentioned, even today. The term Kush or Kushi is used in Hebrew in a derogatory word. way. It's the equivalent of the N-word. But I mean, I'm not familiar with the article per se. I would have to see that to give a better, more elaborate answer.
Matt, are you aware of the article?
No,
Or
I'm not, unfortunately.
okay, so well, maybe Katie, you could just give us a couple of points while we look at another question. I think Hind Mekki was with us a minute ago. She said, what kind of investment, monetary, academic, or otherwise, is the government of Sudan dedicating to preserving these sites, protecting them from looters, and promoting tourism there? Which again, tourism is very problematic, but what's the investment?
Not enough. I think that's really the best
Is
answer.
there a ministry of antiquities like what we see in Egypt? What a type of investment that's
there is a ministry of I think the antiquities agency I think is a part of the Ministry of Culture, but I mean it definitely does not have enough funding. There are not enough Sudanese archaeologists. There are some. Many of the the early Sudanese archaeologists come in the late 60s and early 70s. Much of the local interest in archaeology really came in the 60s with the construction of the Aswan High Dam, Lake Nasser, and the UNESCO global campaign to rescue ancient Nubia. And that's where you see Sudanese getting into archaeology. Interestingly, today, one of the ministers of this transitional government, Intisar Segheiroun, a woman, was one of the first archaeologists and first women to get involved in archaeology. But not enough funding, I think, from the state. And this goes back to the idea that many states, and not just Sudan, but I think in the global south, I mean, unless there was an economic interest that was seen linked to archaeology, not enough funding has been put into archaeology. There was a few years ago some funding from the state of Qatar to support archaeology in Sudan. That has, I think, ended last year or this year.
I think it's going to revive. I think in the next year or so is what I've heard.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's just. I mean, it's dependent on foreign investment. I think it's also one of the challenges, and what kind of ties come along with foreign investment. But there needs to be more investment from the state. In terms of actual archaeology, in terms of education, establishing a new generation of Sudanese archaeologists that can look deeper into this.
I actually completely forgot, I'm sorry, but I should have started the discussion by actually focusing on the current floods that Sudan is facing, and actually calling both for you to really reflect upon it and ask people who can support to find ways to extend their support for the needs that are going to be emerging as a result of the massive floods. So I was just excited to get into a conversation about the articles that I completely forgot because I wanted to start with this. So Isma'il, maybe if you want to speak a little bit and also maybe direct some people, if if not, I'll make sure to put on Facebook and other places ways for people that could extend support and help.
Right. I mean, this has been a very difficult year and a half in Sudan with the revolution, with the pains of transition, the negotiations for peace with rebel movements, the pandemic, and now the floods. This year we saw exceptionally, high and rainfall in the Ethiopian highlands that have flooded the Blue Nile and the River Nile. Houses of people's, thousands of people have been displaced. Over 100 people have been killed. Just today, I mean, just couple hours ago, there was a news piece about the high waters of the Nile near the ancient royal city of Meroe, threatening that ancient site. There is, these natural disasters, have an impact, of course, on people's lives and the ancient history. But I think also it's important to keep in mind how this is also connected to climate change. Sudan is probably one of the top countries in the world that is impacted negatively by climate change. I was in Sudan in 2013 with the floods of 2013. The pattern is that during the rainy season, which starts in mid-July to mid-October, usually with climate change, you see a delay in when the rain starts, but when it pours, it pours. I think that's what we're seeing this year also. We haven't seen levels this high of the Nile in 100 years, it is just it's adding to the misery of the people with the pandemic and with the pains of transition. In 2013, Sudanese youth revived a tradition known as nafir. It's an Arabic word, a call to action. I know that a group today is collecting donations online. Nafir Aid. I can send you the link to that group that is seeking to distribute aid to the people that have been affected by the floods.
By all means. So I'll make sure to put it on my Facebook and share it. And I know other groups also are coming out to help. But it's really a very pressing need, especially at a time where we have a global pandemic, a crisis like what's happening in Sudan. You have Sudan not covered in general normal circumstances. That adds to lack of attention at this particular time.
Mm-hmm.
We have a question from Sarah. Say, thank you so much for your insight. I also want to ask, what advice would you advise both of you have for young historians, archaeologists, journalists who want to get involved in researching Sudan's history at a deeper level? So a young, journalist, scholar, photographer, archaeologist, what's your advice?
Yeah. Well, I think my best advice, if you haven't already, is to go there. And that the technology. There's plenty of projects, both American, European, and Sudanese projects excavating every year. Well, not this year, but most every year in Sudan. And if you're a student, oftentimes they take volunteers. You don't have to be part of their university, but archaeology, going on projects and volunteering and studying as a student is really what got me into this in the first place, and what's led me on an incredible journey around the world to a variety of unexpected places and eventually Sudan. Sometimes just going there seems like the hardest step, but archaeology is a fantastic way to do that and to really get immersed into the country and hopefully turn to love it.
I mean, to add to that, I think it starts with looking into the research that has been done on this, the books. One documentary that played a pivotal role in my own life was the late Basil Davidson's Africa, that from 1984. That was one of the first documentaries that portrayed Africa in a different light. Basil Davidson was the British historian, journalist, who challenged many of the common perceptions in the West of African history. That very first episode, Different but Equal, was the very first time that I saw the pyramids of Sudan, on a TV screen. I think looking into that research, those documentaries, those books, learning the language or the languages of Sudan, be it Arabic, be it Nubian, be it whatever the region that a person might be interested in researching, I think would be a very first good step. And going there today is much easier than it was before the revolution. I mean, just seeing those sites, ancient Meroe, ancient Nepeta, I think have a profound impact on anyone.
And before,
no, go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt. Before I forget real quick, I was thinking back to the previous question on funding and hopefully preserving more sites there. The whole reason I found out, or the whole reason I began pursuing this project in the first place, was through a colleague who is at Johns Hopkins University, and there's a professor, Doug Comer, there, who's just began a collaboration with the Ministry of Culture to design a long-term sustainable tourism funding and conservation program for the archaeology of Sudan. And his past work has been, for example, Petra in Jordan or Machu Picchu in Peru, and has been very successful. And they recently made a new museum at Meroe and are now going to Jebel Barkal to completely design a new museum there and try to get lots of external funding from other places. And so while it's been a very difficult journey in the past, hopefully there's a brighter future ahead in that regard.
Talib Abdul Rashid is asking the question, looking to Matt's excellent translation of Bilad al-Sudan as Land of the Black Nations, and Ismail's reference to the modern nation states of Kenya and Ethiopia, is it reasonable to view ancient Ethiopia and Kush as essentially the same vast kingdom by different names?
Not necessarily, at least from the interviews that I asked very similar questions from some of the archaeologists that I interviewed for this essay on the term Ethiopia. Ethiopia was a term that the Greeks used for the land south of Egypt, and the most immediate land, of course, was what today is northern Sudan or ancient Kush or ancient Nubia. Modern day Ethiopia adopted the name at a later stage, but of course, you know, Ethiopia, the country Ethiopia, has its own ancient history. You know, the kingdom of Aksum, which was a rival to Meroe. Now, these kingdoms, these polities, of course, had their links, trade between themselves, military rivalry. But I think there still needs to be more research on what kind, exactly what kind of relations that they may have had among themselves. One of the common understandings on the history of ancient Meroe, that it was sacked by King Arizana of Aksum. That was for a very long time the understanding of how the ancient how Kush, the civilization of Kush, ended. But today, I think archaeologists are revisiting that theory, and so it's still not clear. I think there's just still much more research that needs to be done. But these places, I mean, they were neighbors. There was trade among themselves. I mean, there were definitely relationships.
Matt, do you have something to want to say?
No, I think Ismail said it perfectly. I mean, it's tricky archaeologically to look again at how people identify themselves, and so as ancient literary sources look at that whole area as the Ethiopians. I think, as Ismail said, there were many individual kingdoms or city-states within them that identified separately and were quite different. They were all interrelated. They were all connected. The way we try to describe this in class sometimes is by looking at a state like California, for example, where sure, it's all California, but the people who live in Los Angeles view themselves very differently and have very different lives than the people who live in Sacramento or San Diego. And so I think it's kind of an analogy to how a lot of these kingdoms were interrelated in North Africa, that they were all under a general sphere. They all were related to one another, but individually they were very different as well.
My last question that maybe I want you to think aloud with me. We have the Black Lives Movement that is taking place. We have a shift or attempt to try to get a new ethnic studies curriculum in schools and colleges to re-examine our history here in the US. But with it, how do you see both of your work of also thinking of Africa as it relates to the experience of Black Americans and rethinking of the long history? And again, this is thinking out loud and to see where do you see your work as it narrates an aspect of history that is outside of the current curriculum, whether K through 12 or at the university level. Either one of you.
I mean, as I mentioned, what got me interested into this was not finding myself in the, as a child in the history books that I studied, whether here in the United States or in the Middle East. And that's what pushed me to study and acquire as many books and go to the museums in Sudan and to learn about my own history. I mean, what I hope is that an essay like this, whether the Smithsonian essay or Matt's Archaeology Magazine essay, I think, at this moment in history, spark greater interest in understanding the place of ancient Africa in the classical world, so to speak, or the ancient world. Finding yourself in those books at a young age, I think it just gives you a different perspective of who you are and your place within global civilization.
Yeah, I think telling the story of histories that have been marginalized, pushed off to the side, is very difficult to do, and oftentimes it's like trying to cram an incredible story through a door that's open that much. But with the Black Lives Matter movement, I think that door has opened quite a bit, and so it's a really fantastic point in history to be exposing these stories, because I think they're going to gain a lot more traction and hopefully not be on the margins anymore, but actually become part of the core history. And personally, I would absolutely love to see that happen with North African history, but also other marginalized narratives as well. I think this is the perfect time for those stories to get out there, for them to be told, and for people who are aware of them to really take advantage of this this energy that is out there in the world, because it built off of something negative, but it has the potential to be incredibly positive. And for those of us who have skill sets to do something about that, I think it's a great time to do it, and it'll hopefully last.
And if I can quickly point out, I mean, linking to ancient Nubia, ancient Kush, has always been a part of the African American cultural consciousness. I mean, you have hip hop groups like Brand Nubian, the French group Les Nubians, terms like My Nubian Queen. There's always been this connection in Black consciousness to ancient Nubia and ancient Kush. And at this moment in history, I think this is an opportunity to emphasize that even more.
What's your next project, if you have any plans, whether in this field or other fields? So what do you have on your agenda?
There are a lot of projects. I would definitely, I mean, in terms of related to this field, would like to explore the Christian era of Sudan. I think that also is a period of Sudanese history, of Christian history globally, that is not understood well, even though it had produced some of the most amazing murals, the murals of the Church of Faras, that are in the National Museum in Sudan, and also in the museum in Warsaw, Poland. There are a few books that we, in English or even in Arabic or Italian, that discuss this. So I'm hoping to maybe do more research on this and shed light on it. But there, this I think, like I said, this is a moment in history where there is greater acceptance to understanding, or at least to be curious of these marginalized histories.
I'm off to my next project actually next week to the deserts of Utah to look at Chinese railroad worker camps, because similar to the story of Kush, the history of Chinese railroad workers who built the railroad from Sacramento to Promontory Point has been largely erased. There's very little information about it, and even the descendant communities here don't have any stories about that. And so there's a team of archaeologists working with the descendants of the workers to try to excavate sites and retell these lost histories. And so I'm going to go cover that and hopefully tell a similar story. We'll see what happens.
I'll be interested if you have, once you get that, because one section of my course in the spring, I do actually cover the Chinese American experience.
Oh, interesting.
And I do cover some of the violence that was committed against Chinese in Wyoming, in Colorado, in Utah. So it's a really fascinating history, especially connected to the railroad.
That'll be interesting to see.
Yeah, absolutely. I forgot to ask a question from Isra here. She said, we often quote European scholars on issues relating to Nubia. When will and have they, Sudanese scholars, decolonized the discipline? And is it a priority today? Maybe you could offer some of the Sudanese scholars, and I could actually add it to the post on Facebook or YouTube later on, if you have some of the Sudanese archaeologists and maybe historians that work on this topic.
Right. I mean, there are a number of Sudanese archaeologists. I think one of the challenges that they face, of course, is funding, support from the state, even to study the discipline. I mean, the study of archaeology socially is looked down upon, or but I mean, speaking to some of them, I think there's greater hope today that, especially after the revolution, and then there's greater interest in Sudan's ancient history, that we might see, hopefully, a new generation of Sudanese archaeologists. But there are a number of archaeologists. I can send a list of names that I know of people who I've worked with, interviewed in the past, that can. I mean, there is. I mean, as one archaeologist that I interviewed for the piece, told me that it's a relationship between archaeologists coming from the West who have the expertise, who have the funding, and between the local knowledge, and how to merge both together for better research and for a better outcome. And hopefully, in years to the coming years, that we'll see archaeology greater established in Sudan, for the benefit of research.
No, I think that's true. I mean, unfortunately, even in places where economies are doing quite well, archaeology tends to be very low priority for places where it can get funding. And so in countries where it's more difficult to get funding, as Ismail said, it's just very hard to do. But the variety of sites we visited when we were there, each one had more than one or several local Sudanese archaeologists working on the sites, and they're publishing and getting the information out there. But this is a whole separate topic. But unfortunately, the way so much academic literature doesn't get out there into the world, there's brilliant writing coming out of Sudan by Sudanese archaeologists, but sometimes it's just hard to find or hard to get a hold of.
And also the language barrier. Sometimes it's written in Arabic, so that's just a major challenge, whether you actually have access to their work.
Right.
Great. So really, this was an enriching conversation, delving into some topics that are often not discussed. I recommend for people, I put on the chat both articles, Matt's article and Ismail's article. Please access them, but more importantly, share them, because that's how we could energize and get people interested in subjects and topics that are not there. So I say these days, if a tree fall in the forest and nobody hears it or sees it, did it really fall? Today, if it's not on the internet, if it's not on YouTube, if it's not on Instagram, on Twitter, then it really did not happen. So part of our responsibility collectively as co-producers of knowledge and participants in making known that which is not addressed, I encourage you all to share this information to make it accessible to people. And if you happen to be a person who teaches, and I know some of our audience are in universities and colleges, make sure to actually put it on part of your reading. That's how you make it, actually, you make the piece having a long shelf life. Because if we don't do that, again, every day there's an avalanche of new material. So this is how also to make sure that some of these quality pieces, and I see both of these are quality pieces that reorient and give us a view on an aspect of history, an aspect of culture and society that is not seen. And again, as Isma'il and Matt said, if you are able to visit, but also make sure to not to be one of those tourists that does not have a respect and attention to both preserving and making sure that whatever you visit is maintained for the future future societies and future generation. So both Isma'il and Matt, thank you very much for this rich conversation, and wish you and all your families the best, and stay safe.
Thank you.
Likewise, thank you.
You're welcome. Take care.